miss him," said Mr. Krantz to Will as they sat on the bench that afternoon. There was no cultural outing that day, as there had been on Sunday afternoons at the start. The last one had been on the day Morag Himmelfarb was expelled. Dr. Fugg didn't explain why. She had simply stopped mentioning them. Mr. Krantz sighed. "I'll miss him. I really will," he said again, as he always did after an expulsion. "Poor Ernest. Think of the opportunity he's thrown away. If only he hadn't fallen into the pool with his clothes on." "He couldn't help it, Mr. Krantz," said Will. "It's hardly a reason to be expelled." "But it is clumsy, Will. You have to admit that." "So it's clumsy." "I suppose the professor thinks a leader shouldn't be clumsy," said the housekeeper. "Do you really think so, Mr. Krantz? Clumsiness unbecoming a leader. Do you really believe that?" Mr. Krantz sighed again. He shrugged helplessly. "Anyway," muttered Will, "Ernest was tripped. Everyone knows it." "Really? Why doesn't someone tell the professor?" "What difference would it make?" Mr. Krantz frowned. "I don't understand, Will. I just don't understand. The professor must know what he's doing. He's a brilliant man, much cleverer than me. He wants you to be leaders. He wants you to succeed. Why else would he have created the academy? He has high standards, I suppose. Who am I to question him?" "Maybe somebody should." "Now, Will, be patient. Don't jump to conclusions. You haven't done anything to worry about, have you? Think of the opportunities you have. You wouldn't throw that away. This is the future, Will. Here, right in front of you." "If this is the future, Mr. Krantz, maybe we'd be better off with the past." The old man shook his head. "Tush, Will Buster, tush and tittle. You sound like one of those old teachers I told you about. The next thing you'll be saying you want to join them. They meet every Friday at 4 o'clock in the old school on Deacon Street, in the old town. That's where you'd have to go. Can you imagine it? The old town, Deacon Street, at 4 o'clock on a Friday." Mr. Krantz glanced at Will. "Dreamers, Will. Hopeless dreamers, clinging to the past. What do they know? No, you wouldn't want to get mixed up with them, Will. You wouldn't want to go down there, would you, Will? No matter what happens." The hostility between the groups had resurfaced. The taunts had begun again. Things were as bad as before and getting worse. The following Sunday, Professor Gelmet struck his biggest blow yet, a quadruple expulsion. Amongst the 4 children to be expelled was Sancha Zellweger, a big athletic girl who was good at sports. Will had sometimes played tennis with her. Sancha had asked for a 3rd helping of rice pudding at dinner. Her crime? Appetite unbecoming a leader. "Read the small print!" shouted the professor. "Appetite unbecoming a leader will result in expulsion. Professor Gelmet—" "Shall decide what appetite is unbecoming," read Stanley from the info tablet when they got back to their room. "It's here, Will, at the very end of the small print." Will wasn't surprised. Nothing could surprise him anymore. "What else can we do, Dr. Fugg?" said the professor. Still, he doesn't react. "In his thoughts he does, Professor Gelmet." "Yes, in his thoughts. The helmet tells us that in his thoughts he's wondering about rebellion, and we reinforce that with the knowledge inputs we give him. But we don't see any of it in what he does. He tampered with the helmet, didn't he? Why doesn't he do something now?" "Oh, he likes strategy," said Dr. Fugg. "He likes to know why things are happening. Perhaps he's the kind of person who thinks more than he acts. The kind of person who likes to know what's going on, but not necessarily to do anything about it." "No!" cried the professor. "No, we can do better than that with him, Dr. Fugg. If the helmet can't do better than that, what's the use in having it? What's the point of everything I've put into it? The whole point is to change him, to mould the personality." The professor shook his head impatiently. Show me his details." Dr. Fugg pressed the pads on her control palette. "Yes," murmured the professor, reading the displays. "In his thoughts, he rebels." The professor looked along the image screen, which was now riddled with gaps. "Think of all the children who are gone. Morag Himmelfarb, Carlos Detto, Ribula Zingarelli, Ernest van Geet, Luke Sonderbinder. Soon we won't have any of his friends left to get rid of. Why doesn't he act? We could expel Davina McCready or Stanley Prowse, suggested Dr. Fogg. The professor sighed. I didn't want to lose them. Their relationship with Bartholomew Jenkins is worth watching. He frowned, thinking about the difficult choice he faced. But I do want to see if we can make him act, he murmured. Perhaps we will have to sacrifice one of them. This is interesting, said Dr. Fogg. What? Dr. Fogg used the palette, scrolling the information and pictures in one of the displays and watching it with narrowed eyes. He's friendly with Barnaby Crantz. Lots of the children are. No, look, Professor Gelmet, he's very friendly with him. They talked after yesterday's expulsions. In fact, Dr. Fogg scrolled through the display. After every expulsion, it seems, they've talked. Really? Let me see. Professor Gelmet took the control palette. He studied the information on the screen. Yes, this is interesting. Professor Gelmet pressed on the palette to bring up more details. Very interesting. As the children came in for breakfast, Professor Gelmet was waiting with Hendrik Targ. Sit, leaders, said the professor. He watched until they were all seated. Bartholomew Jenkins and his gang went to one table. The others went to the second table. The children looked at the professor warily. No one touched any of the food. Leaders, I have come to inform you that Mr. Barnaby Crantz has been asked to leave the academy. The children stared. Even the Jenkins gang looked astonished. I have reason to believe that the opinions and attitude of Mr. Crantz were not suitable for your development as leaders, continued the professor. He was leading a number of you astray. It was a mistake to employ him, and I apologize. He has already been escorted from the premises. Will didn't understand. He frowned, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Mr. Crantz? Gone? No. He looked up. Suddenly he was aware that the professor's pale blue eyes were staring directly into his own. Yes, Will Buster, said the professor. Will was startled. What is it, Will Buster? Well, Will tried to gather his thoughts. Where's Mr. Crantz gone, Professor Gelmet? What's going to happen to him? That's none of our concern. Mr. Crantz is no longer a part of the academy. Give him no more thought, Will Buster. The professor turned back to the other children. Hendrik Targ has consented to take over Mr. Crantz's duties while continuing to organise your activities until we find a new housekeeper. Hendrik Targ folded his arms and nodded grimly. Any more questions? Asked the professor. No. He waited a moment longer, then left. The row waiters moved quietly around the foodarium, bringing out fresh toast and juice. Will remembered the first day he had eaten here, when Mr. Crantz kept calling out, Arthur! To the row waiters. Bartholomew Jenkins had laughed at Arthur Galbandian, saying he'd never be a leader. Arthur was gone now, one of the victims of Sunday's quadruple expulsion. There had been 30 kids in the foodarium on that first day, and the tables had been full. Now the Jenkins gang sat at one table and everyone else sat at the other, and there were lots of empty chairs. And the chair against the wall where Mr. Crantz had sat, where he had always sat during every meal since Will had arrived at the academy, was occupied by Hendrik Targ, dressed in his crisp green suit, keeping an eye on everyone. Thanks for joining us. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet.